The World Report on NewsX World. Let's take a look at some of the top headlines of the hour. Defence Secretary Pete Hegseth holds talks with China and India at an ASEAN summit in Malaysia, seeking to strengthen US regional influence. Hegseth says he warned China that Washington will stoutly defend its interests in the Indo-Pacific while signing a 10-year defence pact with India. President Donald Trump calls on Republicans to end the Senate filibuster rule to pass a funding bill and end the 30-day government shutdown. Trump says it's time to use the nuclear option as millions face service cuts and federal workers miss pay, while senators show little sign of a deal. Ukraine's security chief Vasyl Milyuk says Kiev has struck 160 Russian oil and energy facilities this year in attacks aimed at cutting Moscow's war funding. Milyuk tells reporters the strikes will continue as part of Ukraine's effort to weaken Russia's economic and military capabilities. Ukraine's Foreign Minister Andrei Sybiha urges the European Union to increase tariffs on Russian imports if any member state blocks new sanctions. Sybiha made these remarks during a meeting with President Volodymyr Zelensky, saying Kiev will push the issue to strengthen pressure on Moscow. Chinese President Xi Jinping held his first formal talks with Japan's new Prime Minister, Sanai Takaichi, at the APEC summit in South Korea. Seen as a China hawk, Takaichi has toned down her rhetoric on Beijing after taking office earlier last week. Prince Andrew is not expected to leave his Royal Lodge residence immediately despite losing his titles, the move likely to stretch into the new year. Buckingham Palace confirms he will vacate the 30-room Windsor mansion, while Prime Minister Keir Starmer says he fully supports the King's decision. Tanzania's opposition says hundreds have been killed in post-election protests, while the government claims it is restoring order after isolated incidents. The United Nations reports at least 10 deaths in 3 cities, marking the first international estimate of fatalities since Wednesday's vote. Poland says its jets intercepted a Russian Renaissance plane over the Baltic Sea for the 3rd time this week amid growing regional tensions. The army says the aircraft had no flight plan and its transponders were off, though it did not enter Polish airspace. Now we start this hour in the Middle East, and Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan has accused Israel of attempting to undermine the Gaza ceasefire agreement. Speaking at a global forum in Istanbul, Erdogan has said that while Hamas has been following the terms of the deal, Israel is looking for reasons to resume its military operations in Gaza. The Turkish president has also raised concerns over the humanitarian crisis in Gaza, including shortages of food and medical supplies. Criticising international institutions, Erdogan has slammed them for failing to prevent civilian casualties and protecting peace and security in Gaza. Meanwhile, Turkish Foreign Minister Hakan Fidan has also addressed the situation during a joint press conference with his Estonian counterpart today. Let's listen to it.
Birincisi, ateşkesin devam etmesi için ortada yanlış anlaşılmaların olmaması için taraflarla müzakereler devam ediyor sürekli. İnsani yardımların içeriye girmesi için gerekli çalışmalar var. Ama üzülerek ifade etmek isterim ki istediğimiz miktarda insani yardımların içeriye girmesinin önünde hala İsrail tarafından konulan engeller var. Diğer taraftan ikinci aşamaya nasıl geçilmeli, istikrar gücü ve diğer barış planında belirtilen organların nasıl hayat bulacağı meselesi şu anda tartışılan konular. Bazılarında ileri tartışmalar yapılıyor, bazılarında başlangıç aşamasında.
Now moving on, the Turkish Foreign Minister has also briefed about a meeting that is expected to take place in Istanbul next Monday. The discussions will be likely focusing on ways to implement the proposed peace plan for Gaza address existing obstacles and coordinate support from Western partners, including the United States. We're now joined by Quinton Hitchcock. He's an international affairs expert and he joins us live from Washington, D.C. Thank you very much, Quinton. It's a pleasure to talk to you here on NewsX World. Now, let's first start. President Erdogan says that Israel is seeking excuses to violate the Gaza ceasefire and Turkey is pushing for a stabilization force. From your vantage in Washington, how realistic is Turkey's role as a mediator here? We've seen Benjamin Netanyahu's statements that he says that Israel must approve any international force in Gaza. Do you also think that Benjamin Netanyahu will approve of Erdogan's forces in the enclave?
It's a good question. Thanks for having me on. I think a lot of that has to do with the White House. What's the Trump administration going to do? We have to remember that the Trump administration has a lot of stake in this. They need this ceasefire to work, arguably more than anyone else in the world, not named Hamas, not named Israel. So this President Trump is going to have incredible influence in the deals that the Turkish forces are going to bring forth. So I'm very interested to see, but I don't think that he's necessarily wrong, Turkey, in what's going on in Israel. So I think President Trump is probably going to have to step in, and we're probably going to have further talks about this, as has been the case for multiple years now.
Of course, Quinton, Donald Trump is both fond of President Erdogan and, of course, also President Benjamin Netanyahu. And as you said, that the US needs this peace deal to work. Donald Trump needs this peace deal to work. What do you think are the critical red lines that Turkey must navigate to keep both Arab and Western partners on board here?
Well, the first thing Turkey's going to have to understand and come to agreements with is that Hamas has zero favor with anyone in the United States, anyone in the Trump administration. So there is no path forward for Gaza to continue with Hamas in a leadership position. If any agreement is going to work with the United States of America, that's the first thing that Turkey's going to have to understand. So that right there, I think that's a line in the sand with, I know it's a line in the sand with Israel, but I'm telling you right now, it's a line in the sand with the Trump administration. So that's going to be really the biggest sticking point that all parties are going to have to get into agreement with.
Okay, Quinton, do stay with us. We have one other update from West Asia next, where a Palestinian suspect who approached Israeli forces in northern Gaza's Jabalia has been shot dead. The IDF said that the troops attempted to, quote, distance the suspect, but after he ignored the warnings, continued to approach and posed an imminent threat. The forces then opened fire. This comes according to the Israeli Defense Forces. According to Palestinian officials, there was only one person killed in the area. The Palestinian officials also reported that 3 others were killed by the IDF in Gaza City and one in the Abbasan area of Khan Yunis in the southern Gaza Strip. Meanwhile, the IDF has stated that it remains deployed in Gaza in accordance with the ceasefire agreement and will continue to operate to remove any immediate threat. Okay, we will continue to bring you all the updates coming out of that situation as we get them here on NewsX World. And now we move on over to our next story. And the European Union has said that China's 1-year suspension of its rare earth export restrictions will also apply to the bloc, not just the United States. EU Trade Commissioner Markos Sefcovic said in Rome that the suspension was erga omnes, meaning it applies universally, following an agreement reached between Beijing and Washington this week. China has announced that it would pause its October export controls on rare earth materials for 1 year, with talks after talks with the US, easing fears that had rattled global markets and supply chains. Šefčovič said the EU is now holding high-level talks with Beijing on export controls and warned that only half of European companies' license applications for rare earths had been processed. He also proposed joint EU purchases and storage of critical raw materials to reduce dependence on external suppliers, suggesting Italy could host a storage site. Okay, we're once again joined by Quinton Hitchcock. Quinton, Beijing's suspension of export curb applies to the European Union as well as Washington. But analysts say this move might be strategic and not relief. In your view, is this China giving ground or buying time?
I think it's China buying time. Let's remember, not 48 hours ago, China made some pretty serious concessions to the United States when they met with Trump in South Korea. So I think a lot of this is strategic. China is by far the global force when it comes to rare earth materials. And I know there's been conflict with the United States and some other countries being as dependent on rare earths, on China for rare earths as they have been for decades, going to other places like South America to secure a supply. So it's very strategic. I think China's trying to regain the upper hand, which they've had for a very, very long time. So we're going to have to wait and see, but it's very interesting developments. And might I also add, the European Union has become also probably increasingly dependent on Chinese rare earths for a number of different sectors. So they're looking for a deal as well.
Yes, and Quinton, if you don't mind, for the US and of course its allies like the European Union, how urgent is the rare earth challenge?
Well, it's incredibly urgent. I mean, all of our technology sectors depend on it. Our medical sectors depend on it. Defense, aviation. There's this world as it exists right now has become dependent on rare earth materials. So China has an incredible upper hand, but that increases the level of urgency that all these other countries have, especially with what's going on with a lot of the foreign conflict. You look at some of the wars breaking out across the world. These are desperate times for a lot of different countries for these rare earths. And so I think China understands that. And I think they're trying to seize an upper hand with some of the leverage that they have.
Yes, Quinton Hitchcock, thank you very much for joining us. It's a pleasure having you on. We now move on and over to Europe, and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky says sanctions imposed on Russia, especially the latest US measures targeting Russian oil companies, will cost Moscow's economy $50 billion next year. Speaking at a joint press briefing in Kyiv, Zelensky emphasizes that Kyiv and Washington will work together to minimize imports from countries increasing trade with Russia. Ukraine's Foreign Minister Andrei Sybiga adds that the EU's 19th sanctions package could cut Russia's revenues by $20 billion, directly hitting its war funding. Meanwhile, Ukraine Security Service Chief Vasyl Madkyov says Ukrainian forces have destroyed 48% of Russian air defenses since early 2025, calling it a key priority. Let's have a look at what the Ukrainian president and Ukrainian foreign minister had to say.
Значить, після цих санкцій Росія, по нашим даним, втратить $50 мільярдів США в наступному році. Значить, і ми розраховуємо, що ці ключові країни, які збільшили експорт, що ми з Сполученими Штатами Америки будемо працювати над тим, щоб максимально зменшити.
Дам вам конкретні наслідки прийняття 19-го пакету. За оцінками міжнародних експертів, економічний ефект від запровадження 19-го пакету становитиме до $20 мільярдів. Це важливо, і тому що це означає пряме зменшення надходжень в російський бюджет, який переважно спрямовується на фінансування війни.
Okay, we're now joined by David K. Johnston, an American author, and he joins us live from New York. David, thank you very much for joining us. It's a pleasure to have you here on NewsX World and talking to us about this. David, $50 billion from Russia's war economy next year from these sanctions that the Trump administration have placed upon Moscow. What kind of implications will that have for Vladimir Putin and his war effort?
Well, first of all, let's remember that truth is always the first casualty in a war, and $50 billion is what the Ukrainians are saying. We should take the size of that number with some grain of salt. But Russia's economy clearly is in very deep trouble. Russia is also a society where people through 100 years of experience, and even before the revolution in 1914, understood privation. So they can be ground down a lot by Putin's military tactics and spending. But clearly this will put a lot of pressure on Russia to come up with the revenue it needs to continue pursuing this war and to try and replace the aircraft. And there is wide agreement among those who've looked at this that about half the Russian military aircraft fleet has been destroyed, including their very expensive AWACS type surveillance planes.
Yes, and David, how vulnerable is Moscow now? Of course, we've seen that Volodymyr Zelensky wants to get his hands on those Tomahawk missile systems to no avail so far. However, I wouldn't put it out of the question yet. He says that Ukraine says that 48% of the Russian air defenses have been destroyed since 2025. But then again, Russia have once again denied a ceasefire. Your thoughts on how vulnerable is Russia now, if at all?
Well, Tom, this has been a war of attrition in which Ukraine, over the long haul, you would expect would lose. Putin has put himself into a box with his people, even though he's effectively a dictator. If he were to walk away, back off, do anything other than continue to pursue the war, it would no doubt cause him problems, especially with the people at the top around him. And all dictators, of course, need to have a large retinue of people in many areas who are either afraid or supportive of an administration. So Putin's finding a way for Putin to be able to not continue pursuing his effort of total takeover of Ukraine is just about the most difficult question in geopolitics in the world. I don't see any way Putin can back off. We are beginning to see news reports from both inside Russia and out that there is some rumblings of disenchantment and unhappiness among the leadership core in Moscow, but nothing that I think threatens Putin at this point.
Yes, indeed. And of course, that meeting today between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin has officially been cancelled by the White House. There was much hope by particularly the Russians that they were going to meet in Budapest, with Russian spokespersons saying that it had not been cancelled, it had merely been postponed. However, the White House said today, no, it's completely off. What does that say about where Donald Trump stands right now when it comes to these negotiations, and how diplomacy here, does it still exist? Is it going to move forward?
Well, now is, of course, the operative word, because Donald turns around on a dime and changes completely. It's the Russian use of the long-range cruise missile, which can be equipped with a small nuclear weapon, that was cited as the cause of stopping this. Russia, under a treaty, is not supposed to use cruise missiles that can go more than about 300 kilometers, but they've used several dozen that are able to go apparently more than 1,000 kilometers. That's what's prompting Zelensky to seek Tomahawk missiles, which I'll be surprised if Trump provides them. He might. because they have a longer range than the missiles and the drones that the Ukrainians are now using. So whether there's a talk or not between Putin and Trump, the war is going to continue. And let's remember, Donald was crowing just recently that, you know, he resolved this. It was all going to come to an end. And as we can see, that's not the case at all.
Yes, David, do stay with us. We have one final update for our viewers, and it comes from Europe, and in particular the Netherlands, where centrist leader Rob Jetten is celebrating a historic victory in a closely fought national election, defeating far-right rival Geert Wilders. Jetten said he was incredibly happy that his D66 party had become the country's largest, but also emphasised that the great responsibility that comes with the win. Earlier, Jetten mentioned the result sends a strong message to the rest of Europe that populist movements can be beaten through a positive and hopeful campaign. Let's take a listen in.
I think we've now shown to also the rest of Europe and the world that it is possible to beat the populist movements if you campaign with a positive message for your country, and I'm very proud with this historic result for D66.
And we're once again joined by David K. Johnson to discuss this. David, of course, there was talks of populism once again winning another government in Europe. What more can you tell us about this election, how it has gone, and the new leader of the Netherlands?
Well, the last 2 years, the Netherlands has had a far-right government that is, at the top, deeply Islamophobic, very deeply Islamophobic at the top. The voters have clearly spoken, as the leader of the right-wing party said, and rejecting what's been going on for the last 2 years. Now, in D66, the sort of centrist, somewhat liberal Democratic Party, you have a group that is trying to practically thread a needle. They want to, on the one hand, not appear to be or act in a way that's Islamophobic. On the other hand, they also are probably not going to encourage more Muslim migration into the Netherlands. And you have a very dynamic young leader here in Jetten who is, I believe, only 38 years old. That would make him the youngest leader of a Western European government. But this is a good sign that we are not necessarily going to descend into bigotry and hatred, particularly against Muslims in Western Europe. We're going to see something more moderate and dealing with things like limiting immigration.
Yeah, and David, of course, there was real speculation that the far right were going to win this one once again. Why have we seen that trend rise all over Europe? And of course, there has been further talks of other European countries falling to their far right parties, which have really been gaining traction as well.
Yeah, well, in Hungary with Orban, in France with Marine Le Pen, well, she hasn't been all that successful. She keeps getting a significant number of votes. And in Germany, we're certainly seeing the rise of right-wing populism. You could also have left-wing populism. Populism is a word that implies ignorance. And a lot of the populist movements have been based on finding an enemy. And in this case, it's been immigrants from either Africa or Muslims. And as we're getting a little more experience with this in Europe and the reactions to it, especially post-Brexit, and people seeing how the British economy is suffering because they broke off from the EU and no doubt will continue to suffer, you're seeing people saying, all right, let's see if we can find a more modulated, reasonable, and rational way to deal with issues of international migration and economics.
Yes, indeed. Thank you very much, David K. Johnson, for joining us here on NewsX World. It's a pleasure to have you on the programme. Well, that's all that we have time for this hour. Keep watching NewsX World for more updates from around the globe. Thank you very much for joining us.